Alrighty. Well, again, thank you to those that have joined us live. And if you're watching this later, thank you for watching it. Very excited to get into this topic. So this is education architecture for the agentic enterprise. And really, if we took out the second line, we just talked about education architecture. This is a topic that I've been kind of working on for many years in the field. I'll get into my intro in a moment for those that don't know me, but this is really this is not a tech webinar. We're not going to get into any AI tools. We're not talking about tactics in that way. We're really talking about the precursor, all the things that have to come and it should really be in place before we're leveraging all those new tools that are coming out and the agentic workflows that we'll talk through. So, as I said, even if we took out the second line of this and we just talked about education architecture, this is the foundation. This is the education strategy that really should exist in any organization that's looking for that digital transformation, that's looking for that scale. And so, what we know with AI is that we're just the exponential scale of that is just like unfathomable. And so really that's the impetus for us to talk about education architecture today. So even if you're not yet in an agentic place, metaphorically or or literally, then there's still just a lot here to talk through because all these practices that I'm gonna go through and all the framework is really what I've been implementing and working on personally for the last decade in the education space. So with that, I'm just gonna put a quick poll up here. I have a couple poll questions, so let's do this one. And this question is, where is your organization today with AI-enabled education? And if you're not with an organization right now, totally fine. Maybe you can answer for the last one that you're working at. Cool. All right. So looks like definitely most of you are in the exploring and some piloting phase. I would be curious if you would answer this question differently after we go through the next few slides, just thinking about what AI-enabled education means to you. But exciting to see that that's at least one person here is scaling. So that's great. And I hope that you feel you're in the right place as we talk through this. Okay. No, I guess, yeah. All right, there we go. You can see the results. Alrighty, so moving on to who I am. So I do have a bit over 22 years now, actually, of experience in education in general. The first part of that was in higher ed, working at a career college and in a tech college, basically. So not a traditional university, more of it was actually like graphic design and animation. So I was doing that for the first decade of my career, and then moved over into the tech space back in 2013. So kind of brought all of my more formal knowledge of education into the corporate environment. And since that time, I've led some initiatives at some larger companies like Amazon and Meta, and also in other roles, consulted for other enterprises as well. And I've worked in some smaller ed tech companies alongside that. And during my career, I've held roles as an actual education practitioner, leading the education development and the teams, a product leader. So that was really getting to actually build ed tech products and leading the engineering teams and product design. And then also as an executive. So I've had a couple roles at the VP and C level during my experience. And so I have this kind of interesting lens of how education fits in the corporate space because I've had to see it from all these different angles, and I've also worked in a variety of different industries. So I've worked in, as I mentioned, ed tech, gov tech, fintech, martech, I think ad tech, real estate, just quite a variety of cloud networking. So quite a variety of different industries, and that I only say to kind of preface where this is coming from, where my frameworks come from. It's from this sort of broad range and not really just from one perspective or from one kind of thing that worked for me. It's actually worked repeatedly in all these different environments. And so I just, share that to give that perspective. So I did launch my company Echtus in October of 23, and just personally, I live in New York City with my wife and Dalmadoodle. That's Masha, and I have a 19-year-old cat. So just to give you a little context as to who I am. And I think I said my name, Vicki Kennedy, but you probably know that if you signed up for this webinar. And I think several of you do know me from LinkedIn. Alrighty. So now let's get into what we're here to talk about. Um, so AI, of course, it's accelerating so quickly that even just doing this webinar, things are probably changing right now from when I did the slide to today. And it's interesting because I've been attending different summits and conferences and webinars myself, and I'm sure you all have as well. And there's a lot of conversation about all the different ways and tools and AI technology that we can use. But because it's so new, a lot of these conversations are so sort of like shallow, but I don't mean that necessarily in a negative way. Just we can't really get into the meat of things of how AI is working because it's happening so fast. And so a lot of these, conferences that we may be going to are really talking just about like kind of conceptually and theory and some things that are maybe working, but it's just changing so quickly. And so that's why I really wanted to take time to talk about the underlying architecture and foundation we need before we can get into any of those tools, because they're changing so much. If we spend too much time on those tactics and on the tools, without having that foundation, we're really not going to be able to make good use of those. And so this is the evolution of AI that we're seeing so far. Of course, Gen AI tools, this is where a lot of customer education and education teams are today. When they are experimenting, it's with the Gen AI. So it's the creation of the content itself. And of course, there's a lot of really cool things we can do with Gen AI in the education space. Just being able to build more, interactive content and more personalized content at a much faster scale than we could have before. But that's also like where a lot of teams are kind of stopping right now is with the Gen AI tools. The next step up we're seeing are the AI assistants. So we're seeing the AI that can do those more single tasks, kind of automations, like the more advancement of Zapier and those, where we're basically giving it bounded tasks. And then moving into the agentic space, this is where we have AI agents that are actually autonomous. They're starting to show some autonomy, and they are actually goal oriented. So they're able to make some decisions based on the boundaries that they're given and based on of what they're trained. And then that fourth rung, where we're starting to really get into what we refer to by the agentic enterprise, are the ones that are really using agentic workflows across teams, across systems, across programs. And I think very clearly, we know that not that many organizations are at that end of the spectrum today. And that's why I was saying earlier, I'm curious if I were to put that poll back up, if this diagram changes at all your answer as to where your organization is with AI, because a lot of times we're thinking more about one and maybe two, like the Gen AI and some automations to get some of that content out to learners in quicker ways or more efficient ways. But really seeing the AI agents and agentic workflows, that's a much more kind of advanced way that organizations are starting to work. But what we see with these workflows is, if we were to think about, if I said to you, hey, you can have a completely unlimited budget to add new headcount to your education team, totally unlimited, 1,000, 2,000, thousands of people you want to hire to train all of your customers, all of your partners, your employees, whatever it is that you're, tasked to educate on, in your scope. If I said you had an unlimited budget, if you just started hiring those people and trying to figure out as you go, like, well, here's a job for you to do, and that of course would not be very efficient, right? You wouldn't really even know what you're hiring into. So you may think, well, I would immediately start scaling like facilitators, and we would just have like a lot of in-person training. If scale wasn't an option, maybe I would just hire like somebody to train every individual that I have. And you can imagine how quickly anything like that would break down if you didn't have a very clear strategy around what your team scope was, your department scope, the organization scope. And so if you were to hire, and of course, hiring with an unlimited budget is unrealistic, but if you were just to hire a large amount of new staff, over the next few weeks, the first thing that you would really need to do is have a very clear strategy and vision and understanding of what all those people are going to do. And so moving into this agentic workflow is, of course, that plus, right? Because now we have just unlimited ability to scale and to do very personalized adaptive learning for every single individual learner that comes into our organization. But we can also do it in very unique ways that are not limited by what we have today. So moving to the agentic workflows is not simply just a bunch of automations of what we're already doing, but it's completely reimagining our current practices in a new way that's going to help us to drive the right learnings to the right people for the right goals. And so if you could just blow everything up that you're doing today and really reimagine it from this agentic space and thinking about completely new ways of delivering education. Again, we're not thinking about just speeding up what we're doing today. We're thinking about completely new ways. Again, the first thing we need to do before we get to that point is have clarity in what are we doing and why, right? So that question, and again, if you follow me on LinkedIn, you've heard me say that a lot of times, but what are we doing and why is the foundation of anything that we do. And so really with AI, this is just accelerating the need to answer those questions and the need to have that architecture in place. And so that's the purpose and goal of what I'm talking about in this webinar here is why now really, and why this is necessary before we move into the agentic space. So what makes agentic workflows a little bit different than just automations or again hiring like thousands of people? It relies entirely on the quality of your inputs, right? So the agents act that just the way you might have a ton of interns, right? They act on behalf of the business. And so it is a requirement that everything that is brought into these workflows is clarified, right? Is aligned and is the correct information to give out. And so we need to have things like the business rules in place. What is the escalation logic and constraints? We need to have feedback loops in place. We need to have source of content. I'm going to talk about that a little bit throughout this webinar as well. But source of truth content. That source content is like pivotal to be able to use agentic educational delivery. So that's content that is the accurate source of truth for your organization and that's governed, within your organization. And also those agents need audience context, right? So this isn't just, hey, teach everyone the same thing. And this is also another important point because if we're looking at, I go back to my analogy of, just having an unlimited number of headcount that you can bring in and you have 2,000 facilitators you can go send out. They're going to say, okay, cool. What does everyone need to know? What am I teaching? What does good look like? And so it's really important that these agents have an understanding of the different types of personas, the different types of capabilities that we need to drive, and having clarity on these different roles, because we don't want to give a one size fits all educational experience. And a lot of customer education is still in that kind of space of the one size fits all product first kind of education. And what I mean by that is coming from the perspective of the product itself and thinking about everything that you need to know about that product and the different features of that product and different capabilities of that product. That's a product first way of educating. But if we shift that to all the different things, all the different roles that interact with your product, and so we have people that use it on a daily basis, the admins of the product, the implementers, the servicers, the sellers, all the different roles that interact with your product. That's having this role-based, almost personalized education that really has nothing to do with AI. That's just kind of a more advanced way of educating your customers and your end users. But it's imperative that we have that in place when we're using agentic workflows, because that's one of the biggest breakthroughs with agentic education, is that we can do this very personalized adaptive learning experience, but it will break down if we don't know all the different audience roles and the different capabilities required for that education. And so this is, again, why it's so important that we have this foundation in place, because it relies on the quality of these inputs. And when I set this webinar up, and in a few of the wordings around it, I mentioned how this is really like an executive webinar. Doesn't mean you have to be in an executive role, but the idea here is that I'm not talking about learning theory. We're not talking about instructional design. We're not talking about the education practice itself right now. We are talking about the business, and we are talking about the things that are necessary at the business, at the enterprise level, at the executive level, to really be able to bring your education into this new world, into this agentic workflow, right? And if you are in a leadership position and you're seeing how other parts of your company are moving into these agentic workflows, you want to make sure that education is not far behind from that, right? Because again, if we are using agents in our marketing and in our sales, this is something where we're going to see more and more agentic education. And that's why we're talking about this at the executive level, because this is these inputs that we need to have source content, to have the correct audience context, to have the business rules in place, requires that level of buy-in, and requires that that level of scope as well, because we cannot do this from a perspective of one team within one department within another department, right? We have to do this at a much more holistic level. So we'll get into that as I talk about the architecture. But you can see here, this is not specific to one team. This is something that we have to think about much more broadly. So this is kind of probably a no-brainer, but AI accelerates whatever system you already have. So just another kind of reason that this matters. Today, if you feel like your education is a bit more fragmented and we start employing AI, whether you're employing Gen AI or you're employing automations or you're employing early agents, it's going to just accelerate whatever system you have in place today. So that means that if your education is fragmented, meaning you have different educational experiences kind of happening across different teams, and that's very common where you'll see somebody, some team working on the help center, another team doing webinars, another team doing, in-person facilitation, and another team doing the academy. That could be just a very fragmented experience. And so when you have that fragmented experience, we start employing agents, we're going to just see more of that being pronounced. If our content is inconsistent, if our content doesn't have the same source of truth, so that's the same kind of similar to that fragmented experience. But if we're seeing that one team talks about the best way to work with the software one way, and another team is kind of saying something a little bit different, we start to see that breakdown as well. Ownership. So this is if who's actually creating education? Can you clearly say that in your company? So if that's not clear, that starts to break down as well. And outcomes. If outcomes are not clearly defined, once we start bringing in all this agentic workflow, we don't really even know what good looks like if we don't have that connected to the outcomes. And so, again, kind of a common sense one here, but whatever we have in place today is what will grow. And if you feel like you're in a good spot to start scaling, great, awesome. You don't need to really stay on the rest of this webinar. But if you feel like there's some room to improve that, then that's where we really want to get into having that architecture, because without that, we're going to just have a bit of a mess. So what is enterprise education architecture? That particular term is one that I believe we coined at Echtus. If you Google it, you probably won't see anything else about it. You may see the term learning architecture, information architecture. There's a lot of architecture terms out there. It's really a version of education strategy, but really talking about education architecture from a very specific lens of an organization's education. And I'll just take a minute to kind of clarify my philosophy on education versus learning, because again, you will see the term learning architecture out there. But there's a unique component to education architecture and education at a company, and that is the information that you need to teach outwardly that starts within the company itself. So it's the proprietary education, right? So no one other than your own organization can teach how to best use your own solutions and tools, right? Like obviously that needs to come from within. And even the way that you want your your users to incorporate your tools and solutions within their workflows, then you start having like industry best practices. But that's all coming from your own organization that has to be taught inward, from the inside out. And so that's where the education piece is a little bit more unique than when we talk about learning architecture, which is the internal way that an organization uses learning to achieve strategic goals. And so that has nothing to do with proprietary. It may involve some of that. There's some overlap, but most of the time that learning is happening on the HR side, the L&D team. It's more of a strategic lever for employee engagement. So it's really very much focused on using learning as a strategic lever for employee performance. And so there's, again, some overlap there, but with education, there's a whole unique component of really being able to wrangle and own that source of truth and that proprietary information that you have to teach outward. So I use examples like AWS, for example. AWS, no one can really best teach AWS better than Amazon, right? Like there may be some third-party training partners that do some of that, but Amazon has to be the one to come up with AWS and how to best use it. And so they're the ones that own that certification and own all that training. So that education, when you think about in a university, like the body of education that's taught across all the different courses, that is a thing, right? That's like a curriculum body, and we need to have something like that internally at an organization to really be able to use agentic educational delivery. Because again, if those agents don't know what they're teaching consistently and what good looks like across these different audiences, then it all starts to break down. So that's a very kind of wordy way of introducing this education architecture um, as a concept, which, as we defined it, we have the idea of it being business goals and alignment as the top tier, middle tier is capabilities and the knowledge content itself, and then the bottom tier is delivery and measurement. So I'll get into those pillars of education in a minute. But this really starts to move us from a more education kind of, slightly more myopic tactical focus of what courses should we create to, what capabilities do we need to drive, right? So we're really looking more at long-term outcomes and the system needed to get there rather than the more specific tactics and production that we're doing to get there. So the Echtus Blueprint, this is what we coined as the combination of the education architecture and the framework to get there, which I'll talk about both of these in this webinar. So this webinar is really just introducing this blueprint, giving you kind of a something to think about and work through as you do move your organization and team into more of an agentic space. But essentially, we have two things here: the destination, which is what good looks like, this enterprise education architecture. How can you see this at your organization? How can you see if you're in a space to really make the best use of the agentic workflows and any kind of scale, really, like that digital transformation? So the architecture is really like the final blueprint, what good looks like. And then we have our 7D framework, which is, it sounds like I'm saying 7D framework, which is really just the methodology and path to get to this architecture. So I'll go through both of these. But just to give you a little bit of history on that framework, this is what I have been using and implementing for about a decade in this space. So this is not unique and new to the agentic space. The education architecture is a little bit newer, just to give clarity to what these things are. But the framework is what I have consistently used myself with Echtus clients. This is a foundation of how we kind of take anyone from where they are today to the next level up of maturity in an education program. And it's what I've implemented over the years before launching Echtus. So it's actually coming from practice. And I'll go through how to think about that and how to use that. Okay, so the enterprise education architecture, we have defined as 5 domains. And again, this is really helpful if you are in a leadership role, if you have access to leadership, and executives to have these 5 pillars in place as a conversation point of like, hey, this is what we need to be thinking about. This is what, defines a strong architecture that's going to give us that ability to scale. What is an architecture really? It's just the kind of skeleton that something is going to grow from, right? And so these 5 pillars are the I won't say a skeleton again, but I'm just kind of repeating the same thing. But it's the meat, right? It's the thing that we can use to make sure that we have these things in place and we can scale from that. So this is just a good conversation, good alignment topics. Speaking of alignment, the first pillar is business alignment. So this is making sure that all of our education initiatives at an organization, whether it's a small kind of one person is doing it or a larger team is doing it, but all of our education initiatives are strategically aligned both to a business outcome and to other business programs that are achieving that same outcome. So what I mean by that is, can you clearly say that every piece of education that's being designed and developed and delivered in your organization is for a strategic purpose. Is it to specifically onboard new customers or accelerate partner growth, or is it to expand the marketing department or the marketing reach? Is it to empower our sales enablement? Is there a very clear reason for all the education that's being developed in the business context? That's the first piece. The second piece is it also aligned to the other initiatives that are doing the same thing? So if we have education that is specifically to accelerate the customer onboarding, is that clearly aligned with other teams that are accelerating customer onboarding? Because that's where something can break down as well, right? And this is interesting. I don't have a slide on this here, but there's some conversation around the org chart, right? And so we can all picture the traditional org chart, very top down, very functional. So we have the marketing department, the sales department, the product department, et cetera. But agentic workflows are really starting to explode that, because an agent doesn't know that it's specifically, operating in one department. If the agent's goal is something along the line of the strategic goal of customer onboarding, it needs to connect to, the vast amount of content and initiatives that are happening towards that goal. And so the agentic workflows need to come together around the goals themselves, not just in these individual silos. And so with education, we want to have the same concept. We want to make sure that these initiatives are not working in silos, even from the other non-education initiatives. And that's what business alignment means in that pillar. And so this gives you a chance to see, like, okay, how are we doing there? Can we say that all of our education is aligned to a business goal? And can we say it's aligned to the other initiatives that are aiming for that same goal? So that's the piece there of business alignment. The capability ecosystem, this is one where we really want to see that we have clarity on everyone that we are educating. So I mentioned that earlier. We have all the different roles that we're educating, and understanding what the capabilities are that we're driving. So this takes us more than just a skill matrix. This is not just skills in isolation, but what capabilities do our partners need, do our customers, and all the different types of customer roles and employees as well. Like we have sales enablement and some of the technical employees and anyone that's working with the product, whether servicing or selling it, or making it. Those are all the capabilities that come together. And that's where we need to have real clarity on the different competencies and skills that we're actually achieving. And that's probably one of the biggest areas of growth across, all the organizations that are moving into agentic education, because that piece there is much, much bigger than just, or I should say much more specific than just having a list of product features or topics from the product that we're going to teach, right? Where it's not just, okay, let's teach them about reporting in this product or teach them about, new project creation. That's not where we need to be. We need to be, what are the capabilities that your daily user customer needs to get value out of your product? What are the capabilities that your partners need to consistently sell your product or service your product? That capability ecosystem is what drives agentic delivery. It's what drives any education at scale. And so that's a piece that is often a big area of opportunity. The third pillar is your delivery infrastructure. So this, of course, is systems, platforms, and any of the architecture to deliver your education. And is there consistency across your organization? Does one team deliver webinars on Zoom and another team is using an LMS to host a bunch of content? Are those two disconnected? Do you have different LMSs for totally different types of customers and partners? Do you have one team that's designing on a CMS and another team that's you get the idea. So having this clarity on the delivery infrastructure and having the strategic alignment across all of this is an essential part of being able to leverage agentic delivery. So that's another thing to look at. How is your delivery infrastructure set up across your organization? The fourth pillar is your operations and governance. So this is ownership, process, and source of truth. I mentioned earlier I was going to talk about source of truth. I think I've already talked about it quite a bit, but that source of truth is probably one of the biggest unique things about customer and partner education that doesn't quite exist in other spaces. But it's really like anybody on the call that is been in customer education for a while, you probably know that that's one of the most unique challenges of this role is to wrangle the source of truth. It's not as simple as how does this product work? Oh, it works this way. Because if you do that, you get 10 different answers. If you ask 10 different people, how does the product work? Or what's the best way to use this feature? You're going to get a different response from your customer success team, from your product person that made it, from the sales team that's selling it, from the marketers that are putting it out there. You will get either sometimes slightly different answers, but sometimes very different answers of how to best use your solution. And that is something that it has to come because, of course, as you imagine, you can't put agents on top of something that is not consistent across your organization. And so that source of truth is a really big opportunity. That and the capabilities kind of go hand in hand, but having those two things in place is really a prerequisite. There's just not a way to accelerate and use AI in that space without those two foundational layers. And then also things like ownership and process, they kind of go hand in hand there. But if you could, if I asked you the question today, who owns the customer education at your team, at your organization, it may be a clear answer, but it may not be, because it may be that there's multiple teams that own it. It may be that it's kind of like not even been discussed, is something I see pretty frequently. But that ownership piece is quite important as well. That fifth dimension or fifth pillar, I mean, is the data and performance. So that's making sure that we have the data in place to both be able to set all this up, but also to measure that, right? So the data to set it up, meaning that in order to even know what those capabilities are, in order to know what good looks like, we have to have data feeding that. We have to have data to show us what does what kind of actions do good customers take? You know, what does a healthy account look like? So that's like that leading data that we need. And then, of course, being able to measure and see how education is impacting behavior and how that behavior is impacting business results. That's a piece that is just mandatory as well. So these are the 5 pillars of education architecture as we have defined them at Echtus. And again, the idea of these 5 pillars is just to give you talking points and places to start looking at how are we doing today? How is our organization across these 5 pillars? And if you were to look at how you were performing on a 1 to 5, 5 being cool, we got it all, 1 being we've never looked at this before, you know, you can kind of think through how would you audit your own organization across these 5 pillars. Okay. I'm already talking longer than I thought I would, but that's just my problem because I start talking about this stuff and I get really nerdy around it and I get really passionate. Okay. Maybe I'll speed it up a little bit. Okay, so this is just looking at without architecture and with architecture, and when we have those pillars in place and when we are really, you know, purposeful around those areas there, what can it look like for our organization? And so, of course, without architecture, we already mentioned some of these outdated, maybe conflicting content, duplicated information. And so this is even without agents, right? Like without agents, forget AI, just looking at without, if we were to say without strategy and with strategy, right? So it's the same kind of principle here, but again, that agentic workflow is just accelerating everything. But if we have potential for conflicting and duplicated information with architecture, we have structured, governed source of truth, very consistent in every format that we're delivering it in. Without it, we have that one size fits all kind of training approach. And with it, we have that clearly defined role-based paths. And interestingly, with that one of the biggest challenges I've seen organizations with doing that personalized, adaptive, role-based delivery is really just bandwidth, right? Like you don't have enough people, you don't have enough resources to really get clear on what those individual roles look like and all the capabilities that they need. And that is what we can be really excited about with agentic opportunities, because we can get to that place a lot more, to that place that a lot of us have been wanting to get to for many years, right? So this is giving us that opportunity, and we want to make sure that we can actually drive that. So yeah, so I won't stay too much longer on this slide, but this just gives you a sense of without it and with it, and you know, hopefully I've sold you on the idea of having it, because I think it's good to be thinking about that strategy. So the next thing I'll talk about is how do you get to this good place in the 5 pillar architecture. So once we get to we do the audit, we look at the architecture, okay, 1 to 5, this is how you're doing the 5 pillars. Probably not a lot of you would say we're 5 across the board, knocking out of the park, which is, to be expected. And so what are the stages now that we can take to look at our education and to get clear around it? Practically speaking, how can we get to good? And so this is the framework, 7-dimension framework that I now call 7D. This is the one that I mentioned earlier that I use and implement. So I'm going to talk through this. You can take what you need from this, and hopefully it's helpful. But this is the first 3 dimensions. It starts with the program strategy. So this is now thinking about each initiative that you have. And this is why we're looking ideally across your organization, or at least your business unit, right? So if you're only looking at one little team and there's a bunch of other teams, it starts to get a little bit limited. If we can look across all education that's happening in your business unit or organization, then we can look at and make sure that we have alignment on the program strategy. This is a targeted program so that every educational initiative is driving a specific solution to a business problem or opportunity. So that means that if we have education, it is specifically driving customer onboarding, or it's specifically, solving for a retention issue. But this is when you just think about the definition of a business program, it's a strategic initiative aimed to achieve a goal, a long-term goal. So beyond a project, which is a short-term goal, this is a long-term goal. And so usually this starts with something that the business has identified, whether it's a retention issue, we have a lot of customers dropping out after 90 days, or we have a certain segment that isn't getting value out of the product. We have a whole new opportunity to expand to a different market. But these are signals that we hear from the executive level down. And this is ideally why we design education, to achieve those results, like as a solution to some of those problems or opportunities. And so having that clarity in your program strategy is the first fundamental must do before anything else starts to make sense. And that's the place to start above everything else. So if you don't feel like you can clearly connect everything to a program, and that is also when I talk about this, I use the word targeted a lot, because at a high level, I've heard people just refer to their customer education program, or their academy program. And that's a little bit too broad, right? Because we have all these different, very specific things we can do with education. And so you may have at a broad level, like a customer education team or an academy, but the academy is really just a channel that different programs might be delivered through. And so kind of maybe challenging and thinking about what that word program means and getting really clear on how you're defining that in your organization can be a really good first step there. Along with program, very closely related is your audience strategy. So that is making sure that you can actually define your segments, subsegments, and personas that you're educating, whether that is customers, partners, employees, vendors, whoever it is that you're educating, but having clarity on that high level segmentation. And the segments matter because that's what's connected to the business goals. So all of your customers are connected typically to some kind of retention goal. Your partners may be connected to a sales or service goal, but the segments are what we connect to ultimate goals. And then within that, the subsegments and personas are how we approach driving those capabilities, right? So sorry, I'm going to grab some water. That's how I know I've been talking too much. Okay, so where was I? So I use this example sometimes when we talk about B2B, which I'm guessing a lot of you, if not all of you, are focusing in the B2B space. Some people may be B2B and B2C, but in the B2B space, especially, your clients are the organization, right? But then you have all different kinds of individuals, personas within that you need to educate so that the overall client, organizational client, is happy and healthy, right? Because that's where the retention and revenue number comes from. And so within that, you're going to have your users, your buyers, your admins, your IT people, all these different people that need to understand your product. And really having clarity on all that and all the capabilities that they need is part of your audience strategy. So those two things go hand in hand, program and audience strategy, because that's how you connect everything else. And so this framework is really, it's not necessarily step-by-step, but those two, it's kind of step-by-step-ish, because those two are prerequisites before we can go anywhere further. If you don't have those two things pretty clearly defined, then moving into content strategy becomes premature, because then we're just building content and we don't know who we're building it for or for what purpose. And so any content that you're building in education should really be clearly aligned to your audience and for the specific program. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have modular content and reusable content. And I'm not saying you build very myopically at all, because if you know me, I talk about broad scalable strategies. And so that's not what I'm saying, but I am saying that we should not be designing content just by itself, about the product. The content should be in service of a program and targeting specific audiences or personas. And so that is those are the first three of the strategic pillars before we start moving into delivery and measurement. Those things have to come in place. And so sometimes I see people start with the idea of an LMS or start with the technology. But if we don't have these three dimensions in place and we don't have clarity on what we're doing here, then the decisions around your delivery, and this is also like our decisions around using AI, they are premature if we don't have these three things. Now, that doesn't mean that you aren't going to grow more programs and you aren't going to expand more audiences and you aren't going to keep growing content, of course, but we're building this with a structure in place that will scale. And that's why I always talk with my clients about, thinking big, even if that's not your scope today. Even if today you own one specific subsegment of training, if you take the time and get the buy-in and get the alignment to think bigger and broader, you can build into this more complete picture. And those of you who are on the call that have more of a leadership or executive role, you really get to design this kind of correctly from the enterprise level, because I'm picturing in my mind like just a blueprint of a house, right? My father was a contractor, so I grew up with a lot of blueprints, and so maybe that's why I gravitated to these analogies a lot. But you think about a blueprint, it doesn't mean necessarily in this context that you have to build the entire house on day one. Maybe you're going to start with one part of the house, and you're going to annex the rest of it later, add on to that later. But you do want to have a sense of where everything's going to go, right? Like, so it doesn't mean we have to build it all on day one, but we want to build into a complete picture so that we have later on when we want to add a new room, we're not trying to add that to something that had no sense of a room before. So I don't know, that analogy broke down, but hopefully you're with me. But the idea being that we want to have that structure, we want to have that blueprint in place, and that's the goal there with these three. So that's the first three of the 7 dimensions, and then the last 4, because this is a bit of a truncated version. If you're interested in a longer version of the framework, I have a few things on my site. And I do lead a course in it once or twice a year as well. But the 4th dimension is delivery. So this is what I was saying. If you are ready to choose a new LMS, or it doesn't have to be an LMS, but you're looking at your tech stack, you're now thinking about how you want to deliver your education at scale. And again, this is exactly where AI fits in as well. We're starting to look at agentic delivery. This comes 4th to program, audience, and content. And allows us to really be thinking about those inputs first before we start with the tool or we start with a solution, that we don't really have those foundations. So that's the delivery piece. It really includes everything about the tech stack and also just different ways of different channels that we use. So, thinking about not being limited to an academy, but other ways that we may deliver education, whether that's social media, email, even SMS, of course, in-app, but these are all the different ways that we may educate our end users or end audience. The marketing is one of those pieces that's often overlooked. The marketing is making sure that people know education exists and that they know why it would matter to them. And so that's connecting individual personas and their educational motivation and challenges to the overall value of the education. And that piece will not go away just as we move into an agentic space. So just because we have agents doing it doesn't mean that we don't need to think about getting our individual learners bought into the concept of learning. And so that's where that marketing comes in, is really getting clear on being able to speak to different personas, making sure that we understand what outcomes they're trying to achieve. That's a very interesting piece of this sort of customer and partner education, is that Customers are not signing up to learn. This is not a space where they're like, I can't wait to take a course, or I can't wait to take this, learn this lesson. They just want to be successful in their jobs that they're doing. And so that's their motivation. And we have to tie in however we want them to learn, whether that's directly with AI or a combination hybrid AI and some other more formal education right now, human delivered education. But at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we are speaking about the value of learning and the goal of that, towards or I should say, speaking to the individual about their goals, so that we can connect that learning there. Um, and then the last two dimensions are measurement and organizational strategy. So the measurement strategy piece is, I mentioned earlier, that's one of the pillars also of the architecture, but that's making sure we have a clear line of leading and lagging metrics with each of these programs. Remember, if we go back to the idea of the program strategy, think about this as kind of a line. We have the program connected to the audience. We know what content we're delivering. We know how we're delivering it. We know what we're saying to them, how we're marketing that content, and now how are we measuring the success back to that program. This goes beyond just engagement metrics. We're not just looking at, okay, well, they completed this course or this lesson or they watched this video. We're going beyond even just quiz scores. We now want to see that we have actually started to move the needle towards that problem that we're solving in the first place. So going back to program strategy, if we have a program designed to accelerate employee or customer onboarding, we want to see that we are actually moving that needle. We're not going to directly influence it. That's not the way things work in the corporate space. We have a lot of different initiatives coming together to improve customer onboarding, right? And that goes back to making sure that that's aligned across all those initiatives. And so we want to be one initiative among probably several others to positively influence customer onboarding. And how can we show that? We show that through a measurement strategy that shows that we are educating the right things, that those things are being learned. And because they're being learned, behavior is changing. And because that behavior is changing, we start to see a difference in those outcomes. So that measurement strategy piece is quite important. And it's important that we have clarity on all those phases per program, so that we're not just trying to retroactively make some kind of ROI case to show some correlation between one thing in the very beginning and the onboarding metric. So that's the measurement piece. The organizational strategy piece, again, this is really relevant for anyone on the call that has that larger scope, but this is about two levels. This is the organizational structure of the educational team. Is it set up for success based off these other 6 strategic dimensions? Do we have the right butts in seat? Do we have the right skill set? And as we move into the agentic space, do we have the right foundation for that agentic employee to start working as well? And then the second layer is the structure organizationally. Is education set up for success in the organization? So I could do a whole nother webinar, and I have before, on just organizational structure, because where an education team sits is very, very, very relevant and important to its overall success towards all these things that I've been mentioning here. So if an education team is embedded several layers deep into one department, it does not have the same scope and capabilities to drive this organizational change than if it was positioned alongside some of these other larger departments. And so that's another reason why I wanted to speak to the leadership level here, because these are things that can best be set up from the top down, and making sure that we have the organizational scope to connect all these dots together. Because as you might imagine, even something as simple as source of truth can be very difficult to build from a siloed team. But if we have that as an enterprise level initiative, to have real clarity in source of truth, to have real clarity in building and understanding our capabilities across all audiences, to really see how we're delivering that across all channels in all tech stack, those are enterprise level, or at least business unit level, depending on how big your org is, level initiatives to talk through. So if you are not at that level and you're on this call, these are hopefully some talking points to bring that up to your executive stakeholders and those that are kind of like your advocate, because a lot of this is best done at that level, at least at the department level, director, VP level above. So so you stay with me this long. where do you begin now? I've gone through all that. As I mentioned, some of that is it's kind of like a fast version of the blueprints that we have on our site. But if you're looking at this, there's kind of a 4 steps you can look at quickly. Number one, assessing fragmentation. So if you think about those 5 pillars, where do you see potential disconnects and areas to work on? Where are there teams, audiences, and content that are disconnected or duplicated across these initiatives? So that's kind of a clear audit. Where do you see fragmentation exist today? You can start with one high value business outcome if you are building from the ground up, but a lot of you probably aren't. If you're kind of coming into something or you're working with something today that's got a lot of things going on, you can still focus on one or pick one that you're going to really kind of like pilot this strategic architecture around. So a high value business outcome, and what my recommendation on that is to really align to the high value topics that you hear your executive team talking about. Like what are the main things that are on the mind of the organization for the next year to 3 years? Those are the ones you can kind of see, like where do you have the most opportunity to connect into those topics. So then mapping your current state. So that's where you can look at those 5 domains and kind of thinking through 1 through 5. How are you doing today in each of those? And then defining those gaps using the 7D framework, you can look at how is your program strategy, your audience strategy, content strategy, et cetera? How is that performing today towards that one high value business outcome? So that's just kind of a 4-step approach to what you can do with this information to kind of move into more of an agentic space. This is just one approach. My approach is usually to come in and blow it all up and then start over. No, I don't really do that. I do a little bit of that sometimes, a little bit of a hybrid of that. But if you don't have that luxury of blowing things up, then this is kind of a place to start where you are. And so leaving you with this executive shift so that we want to start talking more about these areas you see on the right. So we want to get away from this concept of like what course, what lesson, what article are we going to build, and talk more about what capabilities do we need to drive? What competencies do we need to build across our audiences? So we want to get away from things like what platform should we use to what system should we be thinking about? So that system thinking that we hear a lot more people talking about in this space, and moving from a space of just AI experimentation to true agentic readiness, which I will keep kind of repeating is not about just playing with the different AI tools and the different ways that we can use AI, but really all of this conversation that I just had in this last 55 minutes is not about the tools. It's not about the tech. It's about the strategy and the architecture and making sure you have that in place. I will leave you with, this is one slide here on build the infrastructure before you scale the intelligence. Nice slide. That is the link to our website. So it's just echtus.com. You can find the Echtus Blueprint. But I want to just leave you with this, the idea of this that I was building in Claude, as one does. But what does it look like when you've put all that together, to give you something that's more visual, when architecture and all these things that I just talked through are very hard to see, right? Like what does an education architecture look like, right? It's not something we can really hold. But what we can do is start visualizing and thinking, what would it look like if we had this agentic delivery at scale and we were able to really think about education from these program perspectives? And if we had something like, okay, we have a customer onboarding program, I could look at this from the program perspective. I have an onboarding program, a certification program, and a partner enablement program. I can click into this and see how that particular program is performing. What I have here are the different capabilities that I'm driving for this audience. So again, what I have here for customer onboarding, I can see that I'm training my end customers and customer admins. And so I'm looking at leading indicators like 30-day activation rate. I'm looking at lagging indicators like time to value. And I'm able to see how are they actually doing in capabilities? Like how is my efforts to instruct these capabilities paying off? So we have some, positive ones here. We have some room for improvement and helping them understand the analytics dashboard. But this is just looking at from that perspective. This is not a course or a content, metrics. This is not showing me completion rates. This is showing me if capabilities have been achieved. And I can see this from the content perspective as well. So I have content that's helping teach understanding your analytics dashboard, how to run compelling product demo, and I can see like where that content is being deployed. It's in this program. But this is just meant to visualize how this all starts to come together so that what you're aiming to do is drive customer onboarding, and you're using education to get there. And so what does that mean? It means you're building capabilities, you're helping people reach competency, you're helping them learn the skills to reach that competency. Whether you're doing that today with AI and agents, or whether that's a tomorrow thing, this is all sort of the same structure. So I totally did not think I was going to hit the hour on this, but I do appreciate those of you that have stayed on and listened to me. I hope that this was helpful. I'll leave you with this slide. And if you do have any questions for me, feel free to put them in the chat if you have time to stick around, or email me. I am on LinkedIn at LinkedIn-in/Mickey Kennedy. And of course, ectus.com is our website. So thank you for joining, and definitely stay in touch. And I hope that this, that architecture is something that that you think about and start working on in the future.